Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to get started with this session on priorities for the United States in 2016. My name is Rana Foroohar. I'm the assistant managing editor at Time Magazine in charge of economics and a global analyst for CNN, and I'm really pleased to be here moderating this session. And I just want to say before I introduce the panelists that we've actually taken a command decision to throw this a little bit beyond 2016 as well and talk about what the next administration that will be coming in November should be thinking about in terms of priorities for the US in the world as well. So with that, let me get started. I'm going to introduce in order Michael Froman, who's the US Trade Representative, Christopher Coons, the Senator from Delaware, Neil Ferguson, who is the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard, Stephen Pagliuca, I got it right this time?
Pagliuca is very close.
Pagliuca, who is the Managing Director of Bain Capital, and Congressman Kevin McCarthy, who's the Majority Leader and a Congressman from California. So thank you all for being here. So we're going to have a really sort of just very interactive discussion. Feel free to interrupt me and each other. And then about 20 minutes till the end, we're going to open it up so you all can ask questions or give comments too. So I'm going to set the frame, I guess, first by saying that we are in a period of change, certainly in the kind of global economic and political paradigm. We're in a period of fragmentation. There's conflict almost everywhere. And, as someone was saying to me right before I came in this session, in a way, everybody is having a crisis of the other. And the U.S. is traditionally a country that people look to save the rest of the world from this, or as a guiding light. You can argue that we haven't been that in recent years, but our value system has been about that. But now we've been having a lot of that conflict at home. We have a very polarized campaign going on right now, presidential campaign. So is the U.S. positioned to lead at all in a world that's fragmented? What can we do? What should we be doing? And so I'm going to just ask you guys to quickly give kind of 1 minute each of your high points, and then we'll jump in with more. Michael.
Well, thank you. There obviously are a lot of challenges in the global economy and the politics that you describe. And I think there are the dynamics of globalization, technology, the rise of emerging economies, others. There's been just a lot of stress on the system over time. I'd have to say, with all the discussion of the strains in the system, though, I think one of the high points actually over the last few years has been, you wouldn't be surprised for me to say this, the trading part, because even over the last year, we made progress at the WTO in trying to revitalize the multilateral trading system in Nairobi. We made progress in closing the largest trade agreement in history, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, last October. And we're making progress with the European Union and with China in our negotiations with them. And I think it's important because, as you know, for the last several decades, trade has actually led growth. It's been higher. Trade has grown faster than the global economy as a whole. In the last year or two, it's grown slower. And we need to get trade back on a faster path towards growth so that it can help continue to alleviate poverty, take people out of poverty, promote good jobs in all of our countries. And we think that the U.S. has demonstrated leadership and is very well positioned, given what's going on in our own economy and more generally, to continue to lead the rules-based trading system and make sure that our values and our interests are reflected in there.
Okay, we're going to come back to trade and what it's going to take to sort of get the next deal done and get people on the same page. Chris, you go ahead.
Growth solves a lot of problems. And so if we've got a crisis of the other in Europe and in the United States and around the world, one of the watchwords I'd suggest is that we need to continue to do what we do best, which is grow through an open market economy and a rules-based system, but also be America, which has been defined as a country that welcomes refugees, that welcomes those who are immigrants, and that welcomes those of different backgrounds. My hope is that the conduct of the 2016 campaign and how we grow as a country will continue to secure our place as a country that is welcoming and that is supportive and that is open, and not reinforce some of the worst traditions, some of the worst instincts that have been seen or heard around the world. We can develop a model for high skill, high wage, innovation-led growth. And we can develop a model by being good at this at home that then is also encouraging to the rest of the world, that makes open markets and global trade not threatening, not a zero-sum game, but positive and attractive, and that shows how it is possible to welcome and fully integrate those who are refugees from conflict elsewhere. But it'll be very difficult to do. Reminding us of the best in our values and the best in our history, I think, is the right path forward.
Okay. Neil, you wrote a book about America's position in the world and how it's changing. What do we have to look forward to in the next year or two?
Well, I'm determined to be upbeat. I think almost everybody in this room is in a state of Davos fatigue. And the more fatigued people become, I've noticed at this conference, the more Cassandra-like the utterances. And I heard a few of those at lunch today. You know, compared with the period I've been studying, which is the late 1960s and early 1970s, in fact, the position is not nearly as bad as you might think to listen to some people at Davos. I mean, take yourself back to 1968. Now, there was an election year. I mean, you had an outright segregationist running in that election. You had far more violence. Forget Ferguson, Missouri. The race riots that were going on in American cities in the late 1960s were altogether worse. The homicide rate was double what it is today. And if you think we have foreign policy problems, can I just say the word Vietnam? I mean, if you compare our present predicament with the legacy that Lyndon Johnson handed to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, I actually don't think we should be too panic-stricken. I do think that there is a foreign policy mess to be sorted out by the next president, and whoever it is will have to sort it out, whatever he or she says on the campaign trail. And I'd like to characterize the mess as follows. The pendulum swung from one extreme to the other. Both administrations, Bush and Obama, got the Middle East wrong. The intervention in Iraq was ham-fisted and in many ways went awry. But the non-intervention in Syria has been as costly in human life, arguably more so. And we have yet to strike the right balance. And I think to learn from history. One thing I've learned from writing The Life of Henry Kissinger is that the United States is really bad at learning from its own history. It has a kind of amnesia problem.
Is anybody good?
I think we can correct that, but we have to address that partly through educating our leaders better. I'm proposing a council of historical advisors for the next president so that we can stop making these same dumb mistakes that we've been making decade after decade. I want to just say a few more things of an upbeat nature.
Okay,
really
very
briefly,
quickly, and then
really
we're gonna-
briefly.
okay.
Because I think American leadership cannot just be defined in terms of foreign policy interventions here, there, and everywhere. It's about economic leadership. Let's not forget, it was the US that caused the crisis, but the Fed also led the world out of the crisis. And I think we perhaps ask too much of central bankers these days, but let's not forget how much economic leadership the United States is still expected to offer, not only in the realm of trade, but in money, in monetary policy too. The US leads in education. It's got the world's greatest universities. I'm privileged to teach at one of them. And that is a form of leadership we've got to preserve. That means not letting crazy, safe space, politically correct, trigger warning lunatics take over the campuses of the greatest universities. And finally, technology. Walk down Promenade. What are the things that really are striking this year compared with previous years? I'm seeing Palantir. I'm seeing Facebook. And I'm reminded that when it comes to technological leadership, it's the only show in town.
Okay.
And ultimately, those technologies are going to transform not only the United States, but the world. They'll keep doing that. And that's a reason, surely, to be cheerful.
Okay, Stephen, you go ahead.
I have 4 quick points. First, agree with Michael 100% that global trade has really benefited the world, and that is probably the way to uplift the world. Bain Capital was formed 30 years ago with the concept that we'd bring knowledge and best business practices from consulting and actually do that by funding venture capital companies and buying companies and growing those companies. In that 30-year history, we've gone from venture capital to buying large companies in the US, expanded into Europe, expanded into China, and the model has worked. We are living proof the model worked. We've taken companies from the US like Gymboree and brought them into China. We've taken Chinese packaging companies, brought them into Europe, and vice versa. We brought technology in terms of payment space into Europe as well. So it does work, it does uplift people, and it's a model that America has to lead in. Second, big issue I think the world and certainly America is facing is this income inequality. The vast middle class is not better off than they were, and you're seeing that as a result in our elections. People are going for extremes. Many would describe the election as a cartoon so far, with people going towards the extremes. Why is that? It's because they're angry. And in the absence of any positive momentum or cohesive government or cohesive policies, people get angry and they go to extremes. Third point is that I think people are looking for a kind of government that works. I think you can summarize some of Niall's remarks to say that history repeats itself, but no one listens. So we've got to listen to the past mistakes and go forward without doing that. And finally, I think the salvation of the U.S. will be the development, which happened in a big way already in San Francisco. It happened in Boston in 128, of these cluster economies, and that'll spread to the world. So Silicon Valley has created an ecosystem, a cluster economy that is, I think, for the short term, unassailable, because if you want to get something new and innovative done, companies are moving out there. Boston is doing that in biotechnology using the health sciences, and now we're coming back in engineering with Harvard, MIT, and the Innovation District with GE coming back into Boston now. That should happen on a widespread basis throughout our country and then spread to the rest of the world. And you see Singapore is copying that model. That'll be the final salvation. So those are the things I think we're facing. Last point is education. I think our university education is great. The one thing that we haven't changed in 100 years is our high school K through 12 education. We're letting people down on that. That's the only way ultimately to close the income gap, and I'm urging the politicians to focus on that, because that is the only way to close the income gap. It's not about redistribution, although that'll be helpful in some cases, but we've really fundamentally got to lift the educational ability of the United States, because we are not going to have $3 an hour labor anymore in the United States, so we will not lead and survive unless we fix the education system, apply technology to that, and have fundamental reform.
Okay, great. Kevin, last.
All right, your question was not just this year, but into 2017, and take it from a global approach. Now, I happen to be an optimistic conservative. I agree with the senator. Growth solves a lot of problems. I also agree what Winston Churchill said about America. You can always count on Americans to do what's right after they exhausted every other option. So, if we are in a global economy, we have to reform our tax code. Right now, we're driving business out. We're not able to compete on a competitive basis, especially with trade. That's a global answer. That's the first thing we need to do. We cannot ignore terrorism. Regardless of what party you're in, that's going to be a top issue. It's a top issue around here. It's a top issue around the world. And one simple action by terrorists can destroy an economy as well and put uncertainty in there. Third, I like a campaign. I like a campaign about ideas. I want this election to be about policy, not about personalities. Why? Because we are divided. But there's a unique thing that happens in an election. It's kind of like putting your hand in a bucket of water and you pull it out. There's a hole, right? But it gets filled. What's going to fill it? If we have an election about policies and ideas of where to go, the next person who's president, whoever elected to the Senate and the House, there is a mandate and a direction and a support to carry it out. Lastly, I just talked to my conference. I want us to think different in government. I want us to become Uber. Think for a moment. I happen to be in the Republican Party. In 2010, we took the majority. In 2010, Uber had 3 cars. Today, they're worth $62.5 billion, more than Ford. And what did they do? They took a large bureaucracy, listened to the consumer, gave them choice, gave them accountability, and gave them efficiency. What if we take that same approach to government? We all talk in business about this disruption. Same things happen in politics. Why don't we bring positive disruption to government? Because you know what happens at the end of the day? There's more accountability and more efficiency. If we simply have that debate and a tax policy, I believe the next century, if I was investing, I'd invest in America.
Okay, those are great points. Thank you for setting the stage so well. I'm struck, Neil, actually, by what you said about people becoming Cassandra-like at the end of the day, and I think that that's true. But I also hear a lot of different views, very bifurcated views on the U.S., depending on what our political situation is going to look like in the next year. So I actually want to take a little poll and ask people. Let's put aside a Trump presidency, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But let's assume a candidate aside from Donald Trump. Show of hands if you think the U.S. is going to be in a better economic position next year than it is today. Okay, so about half and half. Okay, dare I ask, Trump presidency, better economic situation next year than this year? Okay. All right, so a lot hinges on what happens in November. But why don't we start, since we are at the World Economic Forum, let's start with economics and how the U.S. can lead on sort of reframing, rebalancing the global economic system, and more particularly the global financial system. Neil, I was also struck by your point that central bankers have had to carry a lot of load in the last few years, not just in the US, but everywhere. They've smoothed out the business cycle. That's now changing. As everybody can see, we're entering an era of more volatility. We still have this sort of system where the US is propping up growth in the rest of the world. Who knew we would be here? We thought the emerging markets were going to account for that. We still have debt bubbles, not so much in the US anymore, but although in some parts of the corporate sector, but you have a huge debt bubble in China. What can the US do, 8 years on from the financial crisis, to actually move forward with rejiggering the financial system, making it safer and more sustainable?
Well, I think we need to stop assuming that the Fed can do everything, including be the world's central bank. That's not its role, though it has had to play it on occasion. And I agree a lot with something that Kevin McCarthy said. We have to set our fiscal house in order. How long have we been talking about this and not doing it? I mean, really, tax reform is the lowest hanging fruit that there is in the United States. And I don't understand why it hasn't got done, because it would deliver growth. We've heard twice now that growth will solve many problems. Well, I'll give you growth. Let's do something about the most complex tax code in the world and set an example. Goodness me, at the moment, other countries are setting the US an example as to how to do tax reform. So that seems to me to be a really high priority for the next president. And I think it will deliver significant benefits, in addition to addressing a really quite nasty fiscal crisis that we've been pretending had gone away. And those of us who've been warning about it slightly like, stuck records, are going to finally, I guess, get some airtime again now that the CBO pointed out that, the deficit's just about to go back up because yet again, Congress has widened it, as always happens. It always happens, and it will carry on happening. And one day, there is a day of reckoning because of the unfunded liabilities of the healthcare and social security system. So these are the things that need to get done. Expecting the Fed to tackle those problems, I think, is really dangerous. And we kind of are, because essentially what we're saying, if I may just finish the point, is there's just any amount of debt out there. The world is just super leveraged. Please, could you central banks make sure that we don't have to pay any interest on the debt? Could we just have real interest rates at zero forever? And the central bankers say, not a problem, because we actually can conjure up inflation at will. Leave it to us, because we all did economics and we got PhDs, and it's easy. Actually, it turns out that it's not easy, and they are not delivering the higher inflation that they said they could do. Ask anybody in Japan. Take a look at the inflation expectations as they're panning out. The Fed already looks like it moved too soon in December. So I think we need to redefine this debate, get away from the assumption that monetary policy is the only game in town, get our fiscal house in order, and then get back to some supply-side reforms,
Michael,
some of the deregulation that we can.
Well, there's nothing left in monetary policy to do, by the way. It may be the only game in town, but I think there's very little
we're kind
you
of
can
out
do.
of weapons. I
Sure,
want to
Ray
just,
Dalio told us QE4 was just around the corner.
Not yet. Michael, you were
always
giving the
something
thumbs
more
up
to do.
earlier. Let's hear what you have to say.
Well, look, I just wanted to make sure, this isn't intended to sound partisan, but it is intended to sound historical, that 6 years ago, 7 years ago, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month. Now we're creating on average 200,000 jobs a month. We've got 14 million new jobs in the US. Unemployment's been cut in half from 10% to 5%. The fiscal deficit has been cut from 10% to below 3%, which doesn't mean we don't have more work to be done, whether it's on some of those unfunded liabilities or taxes or structural reforms. And I mention this only because I think you're absolutely right. One needs to take a look at the whole array of tools that one has out there. But when you look at how the U.S. dealt with the crisis with Congress on a bipartisan basis versus how Europe has dealt with the crisis or how China is dealing with its challenges, it just underscores how important it is to take bold action, and particularly on the hard issues of structural reform, to put the growth back on the right track. We went through an incredibly painful period over the 2009, 2010 period, restructuring our auto sector, restructuring our financial sector, our housing sector. It was incredibly painful, and we have much more work to do. Wages have not risen. It's been stagnant for a long time. We now finally see a little bit of wage growth over the last year, about 2.5%. But when you talk about wage inequality, it's not just the growth figures that matter. It's how the growth ultimately benefits the citizenry as a whole. So we have a lot more work to do. But what I think is very important is particularly as we look at China right now, China has enormous challenges. And it's very important that they take them on head on, including the very difficult issues of structural reform and getting to more demand-led, consumer-led, balanced growth strategy so that the global economy can continue on a more sustainable path.
Chris, I want to talk to you for a minute about tax and reform. I mean, everybody wants tax reform. Why can't we get this done? What's the problem? And then I want to hear Kevin's views on this too.
Well, two things. There is broad agreement. There's been a lot of work done on what tax reform would look like and what tax reform would look like that would promote competitiveness in the United States. Michael referenced the hundreds of thousands of new jobs that are being created every month in the American economy. I want to briefly touch on the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are waiting to be filled in the American economy, specifically in the manufacturing sector. We have the opportunity to be stronger and to have stronger and more sustained growth, but in a way that also leads to wage growth and to our showing that our innovation capability can lead the world. But there are a few simple and important things we need to fix and get right in tax, in trade, in intellectual property, in immigration, that would help accelerate that. There are other areas, and you referenced them, where we can and should improve not just K-12 education, but the transition from high school education to work. And with the hub strategy that on a bipartisan basis got enacted in the last Congress, the administration's rolling out, we are learning lessons from Europe. We're learning from the German and Swiss models about apprenticeships and about communities that are centered around particular innovations. Why can't tax reform get done? Because there's a fundamental difference about what we should use the new revenue or the savings for. Rate reduction, deficit reduction, or to pay for new programs. And this is a simple disagreement. You're absolutely right. Our balance sheet is fundamentally out of whack. And long term, we cannot be a global leading country in anything, in security, in trade, in innovation, if we don't have our balance sheet in better order.
Although the U.S. has I mean, you could argue the U.S. has an entitlement crisis, but not a debt crisis, at least relative to other countries.
That's right.
So it's not as though we need to panic about.
In every one of these areas, it's not that we are so great, it's that we are less bad than everyone else.
Right. What is it? The Muhammad al-Iranian is always saying the prettiest house on the ugly block.
And our challenge is, in every one of these areas, agreement on a bipartisan basis to actually take on the practical solutions that are right in front of us would accelerate our growth, our solutions, our innovation, and our leadership capability. My hope is that after a vigorous 2016 presidential campaign, we will actually find ourselves in 2017 in a place where America finally decides to do the right thing and to celebrate compromise and to make progress in our political system.
I want to come back in a minute to the hub idea, because I think that actually encapsulates a lot of what you guys were talking about. But Kevin, first, let me get your thoughts on tax reform and what is the lever to pull to make this happen?
Why we don't have it?
Yeah, what can we? I mean, how can this get done?
Not for a lack of not trying. I give you all inside baseball. This is where we have a fundamental disagreement. When we say tax reform, one side will say, "Oh, that means you got to raise more taxes instead of simplifying it." I think everybody agreed to simplifying it and going forward. There's two things you want to look at when you look at debt in America. In the past, you always looked at discretionary spending. That was everything you thought government was, to our salaries, Department of Ag, and everything else. You know what? We've taken a hold of that, and we put caps on that. Frommer's taking a lot of credit for that. That's when we came in, Republicans, and be able to cap that in. The real challenge is the mandatory spending. That's much more than you've ever thought in the past. And that's the entitlement reform. We've got small entitlement reform, but if we don't capture that, someone qualifies every single day. You're 65, you're there, you're going forward. And we're going to have a very big problem. Now, if we have tax reform, we're going to have an unbelievable amount of growth. And if we have entitlement reform, we're going to be in a much stronger position. This is why we just came off our conference, the Republicans on House and Senate. And we believe to put out a very clear agenda. Now, we know this is not going to become law in 2016, but we want it debated. We want the public and the country to decide where they want to go. Because there's no way it's going to be done where you're just going to craft it inside of Congress without having that debate and talk about it. If I look at America, we look a lot like we did in 1979, 1980. Frommer gave you some growth inside of jobs, but our participation rate is 62.7%, the lowest participation rate since 1978. We look like government is dysfunctional. We have a weakness when we look at internationally where we are. Did America step back and not strong as before? And we look what happened after the 1980s, and what drove that was tax reform. What drove that was going out and helping leadership and putting other countries together with shared values. And I think that's what the country and also the world is poised for. They're craving leadership. And I think that's a responsibility that we all have.
Okay, so earlier someone mentioned this idea of sort of, I think, Stephen, it was you, localization. Chris, you've talked about manufacturing hubs. Even though we do have the issue of stagnant wages, inequality, we also have, as we, all of us who have traveled in the U.S. know, these kind of incredibly vibrant local hubs in places like Columbus or, parts of the Southwest. And a lot of times these communities knit together what we're all talking about here, this fourth industrial revolution, advanced manufacturing, interesting innovations around education, rethinking high school, community college, all of that. How can we sort of harness the power of those local models nationally, and how can we leverage that economically and politically in the world?
Well, Michael Porter has studied this extensively, these cluster economies, and really that starts with infrastructure. Back in the day, 100 years ago in America, they built roads, they built railways, and we benefited enormously for hundreds of years. We've really short-shrifted infrastructure in this latest 8-year recession. But it comes back to what the government's talking about is, how do you get the money to do those things when you're running deficits? And when I got out of school, graduate school in '82, the national debt, the number that the country owed, was somewhere around $1 trillion. Now it's approaching 19 trillion. And so we're in a little bit of a conundrum. It can be fixed. It's actually, they're actually pretty simple solutions if we can get the political will to do it. And it's going to be some combination of tax increases and reform, and some combination of spending cuts and reallocating that spending to an entitlement reform to other places. If we get those engines going, you can support the cluster economy in Boston, you can support the cluster economy in Austin, San Francisco, all throughout the United States, and use those models, the best demonstrated practices, to get that out there, and throw in a dose of the kind of German education reform where we're getting people into high value-added vocational tech jobs, which we haven't done well in our country, and really making colleges, universities, junior colleges targeted towards working in the knowledge economy and better jobs. That's really how to do it. One more thing on the math, if you look at the history of deficits, I think we've run up to 24% of the GDP in terms of spending, and we're collecting 21, 22% over time. The last time these numbers were in balance, it's really simple. If you collect 21, spend 21, you're in balance, was in the Clinton administration.
Right.
We haven't done that since the Clinton administration. Now, when you look at those numbers and percentages, you can draw a line from here today at whatever it is, 23, and say, let's get that down to 22, increase taxes to get up to 22, do it over 6 or 7 years so it doesn't have a shock to the economy, slowly raise interest rates back up so you have a normal kind of risk-free rate, not the very low one we have right now, and then I think you see the thing take off. But we need the political will to make those trade-offs and do it, and both parties have to come together to do that. And again, that's why I think you see the anger in the electorate, because it's not happening. They're looking for extreme solutions.
Neil, you want to talk about education. How do we
Well,
fix it? And
before we get to that,
Yeah.
I think there's a piece that we need to include right now, and that's the regulation problem. There's 63 different government agencies pouring out regulation. Legislation's long enough, God knows, but when you get to the number of words that are produced in the form of regulation, it is truly mind-blowing.
We're leading on regulation.
Well, this is a pathology. It's something I
We're
wrote
not.
about in a book called The Great Degeneration, and we have a major pathology in the American system, which I think is causing massive headwinds, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. Full disclosure, unlike most academics who pontificate on the subject of economics, I have in fact started and run a business. And when you start and run a business in New England, you discover that it's actually harder to do than it is in Old England. And why is that? A tangle of regulation that simply bewilders you, and then on top of the regulation come the lawyers to help explain it to you and fleece you in the process. This unholy alliance between regulation and litigation is the thing that makes it really hard for small and medium-sized enterprises to grow. And that has been one of the characteristic features of the whole post-crisis period. Real stasis in the small and medium-sized sector. They're not adding employees. And why don't they want to? Because it's just a headache.
Well, but they're also not adding because they can't get the lending that they want in some cases, because we have a financial system that isn't actually set up to service Main Street anymore, which is a whole nother issue.
The disconnect I have with the regulation thing is we are the most robust nation in terms of venture capital investment in the history of the earth. And I think $600 billion in capital was raised last year. All these funds are filled up. We at Bain Capital, founding companies in our venture business every year. Now, we get around those regulations. Are those regulations good? No, they were a drag on the economy. But I don't know if that's in the 80-20. We've started, probably 100 different businesses, And if you look at California, Google, Airbnb, all these companies, they started with these regulations. I think I think it's important.
You'd be the first to acknowledge that the one area that is not heavily regulated is tech. And that, of course, is why it's been growing gangbusters in the last 20 years. If other sectors of the economy were as lightly regulated as Silicon Valley, my God, I'd show you a miracle economy. And I do think there's a big difference there.
You got more cash on hand than at any other time. And as I walked and listened to people at this conference, that was the one uniting thing I found. They all talked about, no matter what country they're from, the uncertainty and the regulation making them hold back the capital.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that for a minute.
I
because
don't know either if that's making them hold back. What's making them hold back is uncertainty about demand. So
Okay.
we would double and triple the investment in a company if we found fundamental demand for it.
Yeah.
Why don't we have fundamental demand? It's because you need more global trade. You need more transportability of money. You need more free markets. You need better legal systems in China and India and the emerging markets. You know, there's been a pullback in the emerging markets precisely because I think we've gotten to the edge of the envelope to say, to get really big in those markets, you need much more a legal system that is fair, an outside legal system that gets you results. So we've done well in those countries because we can kind of play by the rules there now. But if they want to be big, you know, growing, they've got to improve those systems.
Notice the phrase "get round the regulation" that you just heard there. I mean, that's I think, a very revealing turn of phrase. It's hard to get round the regulation if you're a small business. And I'm not talking here about small businesses that grow to be Ubers. I'm talking about the small businesses of Main Street. Getting around the regulation is really difficult if you don't have a compliance department. Guess what? If you're a really small business, you don't. If you're trying to start a new bank, forget it. The big boys already have it covered because they have the regulation, the compliance department. And in that sense, we are, let's face it, we're a big business conference. Small business is not terribly well represented
barriers.
at Davos. Just a hunch, but I would say that as true. But if you,
I'm
if you
guessing
look
that's
at
right.
what it's like to run just a small business
Yeah.
with maybe a dozen employees, the studies are absolutely clear. The regulatory burden is much higher in relative terms on those little companies. And I do think we need to address that.
Well,
I think we'd also address some of the anger that people feel in Main Street today.
Oh,
that
well, no,
entrepreneurs who can't get it right.
absolutely. I mean, and you know, one of the reasons that community banks and you know some of the regulation exists that you're talking about is because we have a system of money politics that is totally out of control. We need another panel for that. So, but Stephen, I want to get to something that you touched on, which seems really important. That we're at a change moment in terms of global institutions. The rules are changing. In many cases, the rules aren't being followed. There are new rules that need to be developed around legal systems, IP, privacy, data. You know, how can the U.S., particularly at a time when we haven't been so great about leading institutionally, how can we kind of get in this game and make sure that that our agenda, that the U.S. agenda is, you know, put forward?
Well, I think it's a very complex question. It's a huge, huge issue. If you talk to the business community and the companies that we have, one of the number one issues is the technology being transported, with patented technology it takes years to build, being transported to other countries. So whereas we might have had a Cold War before with military people fighting, you know, we really have a war, cyber war going on right now to take those products and technologies that have been invested in many countries, not in the U.S., other countries as well, that are protected in those countries, and then have them, you know, show up in the emerging markets, the exact same products, you know, piggybacking off that technology. So again, I think Michael should speak to this. If you had a free and fair global trading system, and you had some clear guidelines around that of what you couldn't do and patent protections, I think it would benefit everybody, even the countries that now think they're not benefited by that. They would benefit because they would develop a robust innovation economy. Because why does someone, you know, work in a garage 100 hours a week and maybe fail 6 times to make a product if you make that product and somebody can copy it the next day? So I think Michael would have a great perspective on
Michael,
this.
Why don't you speak to the challenges?
I think Stephen's absolutely right. And one thing we've been trying to do, TPP is a good example of this, is that it's got rules against forced transfer of technology, which has been one of the new forms of protectionism, so to speak. I mean, it's sort of government policy to force countries to move their technology, move their IP, share their code in order as a way of circumventing intellectual property rights. It's the first trade agreement to have disciplines on cyber issues and the theft of trade secrets, which Senator Coons has been so involved in, theft of trade secrets, including through cyber means, and to strengthen the enforcement of intellectual property rights. And then take a country like China, which isn't part of TPP, and this has been a major focus of our effort with them to try and get them to commit not to force companies to transfer their IP or their technology as a condition of entry into their market. And it's something we're working through in the context of some of our negotiations with them too. But I think we have to be very vigilant about this. As tariffs have come down around the world, there have been all sorts of new forms of protectionism. And one form is local content requirements. Beyond government procurement, that you've got to build a product in a country in order to serve that market. And we get it that countries want to have manufacturing in their country. We want it. Other countries want it. It's a legitimate public policy objective. But by saying you can't enter our market unless you move your production here, you're going to end up building walls around these various markets, and that's going to end up producing less innovation rather than more.
Okay, we've only got about 15 minutes left, so I want to open up the floor now to questions over here. I think we've got a couple of mics. Folks can raise their hands, and we'll get someone to you.
Nicolás Mariscal from Mexico. You talk a lot about all over the world, what's going on, but you never talk about what's going south of the border, Now Mr. Trump is talking a lot, and he's doing a lot of big messes down there in the country. But something that worries me very much is the arms. Most of our killing and all the arms coming, 95% of all the arms are coming from the U.S. What are your thoughts on that? When is the U.S. going to do something related to arm control? Or I would just like to hear that. And also about immigration, about all our Mexicans on the other side, that they just want to send it back here to Mexico, somewhere else.
Kevin and maybe Chris, do you want to speak
Sure.
to those points?
There is a challenge, and just recently, Mexico captured, what was his, Chapo. There's early reports that they may have had some weapons from Fast and Furious. In process, not sure yet. We just got some of that through. Have to take a look at that. America has a strong Second Amendment. I believe in our Second Amendment from the process. I still believe if we look and want to talk about south of the border, I think we should look at the whole continent and Canada as well. I think North America can easily be energy independent. I think the changing of your constitution, your ability to open up your fields, I know where the price of oil is today, but oil demand has actually increased this year over last year, and then some. Yeah, we're having overproduction, but that's a big growth. That's going to come back. That's going to be a shared value. I think we have a lot of shared values throughout all of North America. If we work closer together, I don't think you're going to have this immigration question, but I'm one who believes we have a broken immigration system. And America is a country of immigrants, and we got to have a system that actually works in the process. And this isn't something that we should just make politics about. We should actually sit down and solve it, because I said with the senator here, I think it's crazy in America that somebody comes and gets an engineering degree, and we tell them to go to another country and compete against us. There's an easy place that I think we could have very secure, but I'll be the first one to tell you, I want Mexico to have secure borders, and I want America to have secure borders at the same time. And I think when you start with that basis of making sure the borders are secure, I think you'll have a very open discussion about immigration in America.
Chris, do you want to?
One of our challenges in that conversation is how much is enough? We are spending more on border security than on every other federal law enforcement function combined. And I frankly was deeply disappointed that a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate was never taken up by the House, that in my view would have allowed for a balanced path for comprehensive immigration reform. Now, there's different opinions on what the right path is forward, but I agree that we should have legislation that allows everyone who comes to the United States to pursue higher education to have an opportunity to stay in the United States and to start a business and to contribute. But I also think that there are some humanitarian considerations about how those who seek to emigrate to the United States have been treated. And there's been some very regrettable, frankly, nativist statements made in the current presidential campaign that I think don't respect the best values of either of our political parties or of our country. We have to find a way to be genuine partners with Mexico, with Canada, with our hemisphere. And as the majority leader suggests, there are things we can do better, stronger together. But I think it begins by giving real comprehensive immigration reform a chance, taking it up, debating it, and adopting it, and not suggesting that there's more that needs to be done first before we have that debate.
Okay, the gentleman here with the mic.
Congratulations to all. Thank you. Ambassador Froman, I wanted to congratulate you on the 12-nation TPP. I think it's a job well done, difficult, so a lot of work. I wanted to ask why China did not join, and the second question is when will it be approved by the United States Congress? Thank you.
Let's see, we've got your crystal ball right under here.
When we launched TPP, it's a fairly diverse set of countries there around the table. You have some of the most advanced countries in the world, U.S., Canada, Japan, Australia. You have some of the least developed countries, Vietnam, Peru. And the goal was to create a high standard agreement for the region. And I commend the other 11 countries for all working together to come up with a very high standard agreement there. I think with regard to China, China is pursuing its own course. It's got its own regional agreement that it's pursuing called RCEP, RCEP. It's got 16 countries. It's a very different standard than TPP, but that's the direction they've gone down. What we've done bilaterally, as we've had conversations with the Chinese, is to say, let's see what we can do through a bilateral investment treaty to help encourage China to adopt the kind of reforms that it needs to adopt to make sure that its market is liberalized and open up. And that's a step towards a high standard agreement, but that's where our focus has been. And in terms of Congress, I'll defer to the majority leader, but we're working with congressional leadership and with the committee leadership, and both of these gentlemen have been very active in supporting the trade agenda over the last year to make sure members of Congress know what's in the agreement, address their concerns and address their questions, and to work to find the best window, the one that's most conducive for getting it approved. And I'm confident and optimistic that we'll get that done this year.
I just want to quickly, though, ask Kevin, do you want to respond to whether Congress is going to pass this?
As soon as we have the votes.
Yeah, right, okay. Neil, you wanted to make
I do want to compliment Trade Representative. He's worked very close with Congress on all sides of the issue. Getting TPA was not easy, and we had not had that for quite some time. And in the time period that America did not have Trade Promotion Authority, there were 100 trade agreements, and America was part of zero. So it was very important to get that done, and now the work that he's gone, it is a time where we're now looking at it, members are looking through it, he's on the Hill explaining where it is, but our hope is to get that done this year.
Okay, Neil, you wanted to make a quick point?
Is it true that the legislation is about 3.5 feet high if you print it out?
We live in the digital economy. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
It's just one zip.
Little policy slap down
With
here.
the digital version, you can do a word count, and I believe it runs into millions of words.
All right, okay, we're gonna move on to the next question. The gentleman here with the mic.
Wu Xinbo from China. Actually, President Obama still has 1 year to go as the president. It's interesting that all the panelists haven't mentioned this. So putting yourself in his shoes, what will his agenda look like for 2016, and what are the priorities? Thank you.
Michael, do you want to?
Well, he's got a series of priorities, and you're absolutely right. As the president said after the last midterm election, he said, we're entering the fourth quarter, and lots of things happen in the fourth quarter, and we've shown over the last year, working very closely with Congress, and Congress produced a number of very important pieces of legislation near the end of last year that we can get things done. Certainly getting TPP done this year is a priority. He's talked about criminal justice reform, and he's talking with members of Congress about that. And as you saw in the State of the Union and in some of the subsequent messages, everything from trying to move minimum wage forward to a number of other issues to make sure that the U.S. Remains a leader in the global economy, remains competitive, and that we're dealing with some of the difficult economic issues, including issues like wage stagnation.
Okay. Question over here. Can we get a mic to the lady here in the second row?
Hi, my name is Yasmin Shehata. I'm from Egypt. I just wanted to ask a question regarding your policy in the Middle East. As an Egyptian, what we see is whether you're getting involved with the force or by supporting certain governments, it always leads to, for us, destabilization, negative economy. We always feel the effects. And now there's a new thing, a front runner that's openly racist against Muslims. As a Republican, I'd love to hear your thought about that. Is it just going to keep getting worse for Arabs in the Middle East and in the U.S. with the way U.S. foreign policy is going?
Okay, great question. Kevin, do you want to start, and then others should chime in?
Yeah, but it's interesting. She thought you were Republican.
Oh, me, okay.
He works for Bain, but that doesn't mean he's a Republican.
One thing you have to know, and I want everybody in the audience to know, because one person is in a party and says a certain view does not mean that everybody in the party has the same view. And there is an interesting thing inside the debate. Some candidate gets more airtime than others. I would listen to them all. I'm proud of my party. My party is a party of Lincoln. My party has displayed many times in the basis, and if you watched our Speaker of the House, he stood up the day that something was said and said, that's not a conservative view, that's not the view of the party. And so it's unfortunate if you weren't able to see that. We are individuals and have beliefs of where we go. When it comes to the Middle East, I'm concerned about the challenges of where the Middle East is happening because I'm concerned with the re-entrance of Russia into Syria. They had not been a player inside the Middle East. I think that's going to transform and change where it's at. I think there's some instability there, and this is where I think growth would make a fundamental difference to the economies as well. And as an American, I want to support those countries of shared values that believe in democracy and believe in individual freedoms and believe in human rights. And I will stand up with any Muslim country that believes that.
But our governments don't represent us, and you support our government.
Which government do you speak of?
Egypt, where I'm from,
Mhm.
supported by the United States. We don't really elect our president. As you know, we had one elected president, and he was taken out. Nobody said anything, and that is done.
We may have a difference of opinion.
Chris, do you want to jump in on this?
I'll just say, you asked about sort of the path forward in the Middle East and America's position. The majority leader cited his concerns about Russia. I'll just simply add concerns about Iran. I think Iran is a profoundly destabilizing, risky force in the region. And while the nuclear agreement has delayed their nuclear ambitions for some time, I think we will need to be actively engaged in pushing back against their support for terrorism and some of their regional proxies. In the United States-Egyptian relationship, there is tension between the United States and Egypt today, in no small part because both the administration and some members of Congress really challenged the transition and how it happened and has pressed for respect for human rights and democracy in Egypt. We also, though, have to be mindful of the tremendous destabilization in the region that's coming from Daesh and the collapse of Syria. And so as we look at what is the 2016 agenda for President Obama and for Congress, it is my real hope that Congress will do its job and authorize the war against Daesh, which we have not done, and that the United States will be more successful in leading a regional coalition to really constrain and end this violent extremist terrorist movement that is creating so much destabilization and difficulty. Last, statements by presidential candidates that are hateful and disrespectful towards Muslims do not reflect American values of either party. Much of my family was Republican historically, and I was raised to be proud of the Republican Party's role in our civil rights movement in the United States. It is my hope that at some point, all candidates, Republican and Democrat, will address this issue and speak in a constructive and positive way. Nothing fuels the message of hate and separation that Daesh is trying to spread more than having an American presidential candidate reinforce it and suggest that somehow we are not the welcoming, tolerant, inclusive country that we are. So it is my hope that our presidential campaign will ultimately address this and help the world see who we are.
I also like to add from traveling the country
Yeah.
extensively, if you go to American cities, you go to New York City, you go to Boston, you go to San Francisco, you go to Chicago, these are incredibly integrated cities with all faiths, religions working together. It works incredibly well. It's reprehensible that a small minority is getting that message out there. It is not representative of life in America. And unfortunately, for political gain, you can create headlines by saying inflammatory things. But when you walk the streets of New York or Boston or Austin, for that matter, you have an incredibly great society that's integrated, and the whole basis of society, we're all immigrants. So my grandfather was an immigrant. We're all immigrants. And letting everybody flower and bloom and do what they want is the kind of social contract of America. So it's unfortunate that that's out there. That's an extreme inflammatory thing to appeal to a small segment of the population. It happened with African Americans. We're trying to get rid of that. And I think the vast majority of Americans every day wake up saying, we got to stop that.
Okay, Neil, I know you have thoughts on this.
I yield to no one in my contempt for a candidate who's been playing a xenophobic card from day one of his campaign. It began with Mexicans, it moved on to the Chinese, and the attack on Muslims in the wake of the Syrian refugee crisis was just the latest installment. But there's a couple of points I'd like to make with respect to Egypt and your second question. The democratization of the Middle East was a project of the Bush administration. President Obama judged it to have gone pretty badly wrong and decided that was not something that he would pursue. Remember the Cairo speech in 2009. But when your country experienced a revolution as part of the misnamed Arab Spring, the president really didn't have a strategy. He went along with the Muslim Brotherhood government until it was overthrown, not by the United States, but by the Egyptian people. You had 2 revolutions in a very short space of time. Let's not make everything that happens in the Middle East the responsibility of the United States. I'm the last person to say that the president did a great job of handling the Arab Spring, but you can see what happened. There was a kind of trial and error approach. Well, we'll do a little bit of intervention in Libya, not the full Iraq. We'll just get rid of Gaddafi. That's turned out really well. Libya's disintegrated. And confronted with events in Egypt, the president basically said, what the crowd in Tahrir Square says is fine by me. If the crowd says Muslim Brotherhood, okay. If the crowd says Sisi, okay. There was no major intervention, and I don't think it would have been welcome if there had been any major American intervention in events in your country. Let me add one last point. Okay. The president has had to evolve a strategy since these events, and I think it has evolved in the direction of an attempt to create a balance of power between the Sunni and Shiite powers in the region. That is the essence of the Iran deal. If you look carefully at what the president has said about it, look at what he said to David Remnick in January 2014. He sees his goal as being to create an equilibrium in the region by tilting slightly towards Iran and away from Saudi Arabia and other traditional allies in the region. I think that's the strategy. I think it's going terribly wrong because it doesn't necessarily produce balance. It can equally well produce an arms race and an escalating sectarian conflict. That's unfortunately going to be his legacy to the next president.
Okay, well, I wish that we didn't have to stop on this note, but we're not going to solve the sectarian conflict in this panel today. We are at 7 o'clock. I want to just thank all the panelists for being here, thank all of you, and hopefully we'll have more solutions and a little more optimism next year for this panel. Cheers.